This confession hides a shocking secret and one of the most unexpected twists ever. This is 35-year-old Jerry Hobbs in 2005. Just hours earlier, he was arrested for one of the most heinous crimes. In approximately 3 seconds, you'll see him break down and give an emotional confession to the brutal murder of his own 8-year-old daughter and her 9-year-old friend.
I told Laura that she had to come home, and she argued with me, and I grabbed her by the arm. Laura was fighting me, and I punched her in the face, and she dropped to the ground. Crystal came towards me, and I took the knife from her, and I punched her in the face, and she went down. It happened so fast.
As this case unfolds, you'll see that sometimes nothing is as it seems, and even the most straightforward cases can be filled with twists you never see coming. With his confession in the bag, it seemed the investigation would close at the same rapid speed with which it was opened. However, no one could have ever predicted the earth-shattering revelations that would unfold in this case, where nothing was at all as it appeared to be. The girls' bodies were found lying side by side. It was a horrific scene, and it was immediately evident that their last moments had been harrowing, as both girls had been stabbed multiple times. It was later discovered that they had sustained a total of 31 stab wounds. The children were quickly identified as 8-year-old Laura Hobbs and 9-year-old Crystal Tobias. Each wound had been precisely administered, using an extremely sadistic technique. The community of Zion, Illinois was brought to its knees by the news of the tragedies. As if word of the murders wasn't already a massive enough burden to bear, the identity of the prime suspect, Laura's very own father, added even more insult to injury. The events of that day were all outlined in the statement. Jerry set the stage as he began reading the confession that had been drafted for him by the Zion Police Department.
Sunday about 3 p.m., I got home with my wife Sheila and our 4 kids were flying kites at the lake. My daughter asked if she could go out and play with her friends. Sheila said it was okay even though she was still grounded. After stealing, she was $40. I didn't agree with letting her go, but I didn't say anything at the time.
When late afternoon set in and Laura had failed to return home, he was determined to go out and find her.
At about 4:30 p.m., I decided to check on Laura and bring her home. I walked by myself from my house to the park into the trail, where my son Jerry said Laura hangs out. I was walking on a dirt trail and I ran into Laura and her friends Crystal on the trail. I told Laura that she had to come home, and she argued with me, and I grabbed her by the arm. She tried pulling away and was telling me to let her go. Crystal also telling me to let Laura go. Crystal pulled out a small knife from her pocket and again told me to let Laura go. Laura was fighting me, and I punched her in the face, and she dropped to the ground. Crystal came towards me, and I took the knife from her, and I punched her in the face, and she went down. And then went in a rage and stabbed Crystal in the chest and neck. She stopped moving, and I went over to Laura, and she was moving around and fighting. I punched her in the face again and stabbed her.
It seemed the police had everything they needed in order to seal Jerry's fate after nearly 24 hours of interrogations. They concluded the official statement with some final questions.
Is this your statement, Jerry? Yeah, okay. You just give it free voluntarily? Yeah. Okay.
Investigators were certain they had their man. He described the brutal attacks in such graphic detail that there was no question in their minds that he'd committed the atrocities. Still, the idea that a father could kill his own daughter was difficult to reconcile. A glimpse into Jerry's background, however, would detail the path he chose that ultimately led him to such an unthinkable destination. Jerry was born in 1970. His formal education came to a halt after 8th grade, and his criminal career began shortly thereafter. His rap sheet dated all the way back to 1990, and it grew from there. He was in and out of the Wichita Falls, Texas prison for one offense after another, including drug possession and a vast array of assaults, some of which were domestic. In August 2001, Jerry's temper had gotten the best of him. Needless to say, it hadn't been the first time, and it definitely wouldn't be the last. It was an intriguingly strange tale, the kind you'd see on a daytime talk show, quite frankly. The story was that Jerry and his longtime girlfriend, Sheila Hollabaugh, had gotten into an argument at the trailer park in Texas where they resided. As the argument evolved into a physical altercation, 3 men attempted to step in and come to Sheila's defense. The intervention further angered Jerry, and as a result, he grabbed his trusty chainsaw and wielded it as he chased the men around the property. An individual was finally able to subdue Jerry by striking him in the back with a shovel. The police arrived and took over from there. Jerry was charged with aggravated assault after the chainsaw incident. He was convicted in December of 2002 and was sentenced to 10 years of probation. However, when he failed to appear for required meetings with his probation officer, his probation was revoked. Off to prison he went in October of 2003, where he would serve 18 months. In April of 2005, Jerry was finally released from a Texas prison. He boarded a bus and headed northeast to Zion, Illinois, population 23,000. He was en route to Sheila's parents' home, where he would reunite with Sheila and their 4 children, the latter 3 of which had been fathered by Jerry, including Laura and her 2 brothers. Despite their tumultuous past, Sheila was still in love with Jerry, and they were going to start things fresh. Unfortunately, everything went terribly wrong less than a month after Jerry and Sheila reunited, on that fateful Mother's Day. It had started off on such a happy note. It was a beautiful afternoon and the neighborhood had a festive atmosphere. The local children enjoyed biking, skating, and hopping from one barbecue to the next. Later that day, the inseparable best friends, Laura and Crystal, took a shared bike and headed off to roam around at nearby Beulah Park. It was a forest preserve they were known to frequent, complete with a wooded area and ravines surrounded by a biking trail. However, the girls' fun afternoon would be short-lived. According to the description provided in Jerry's statement, the girls' fun afternoon came to an abrupt end when Jerry arrived at the scene. He said it was a perfect storm that quickly turned deadly. Detectives were confident they had everything they needed. It was almost too easy. Jerry was detained and held without bond as he awaited trial. Jerry remained in prison while prosecution built their case against him. After more than 2 years of incarceration, in August of 2007, Jerry's defense team found what they believed to be a game changer. Contrary to original reporting during the investigation, male DNA had been collected at the crime scene. It belonged to a single individual, and it included 3 different types of material. Jerry, however, wasn't a match. Despite the new information, prosecutors explained it away with a bizarre, far-fetched theory. They proposed that the girls had been playing in an area that people were known to frequent and utilize for extracurricular activities of sorts. That was their rationale as to why DNA was found on Laura. It had inadvertently transferred onto her. The prosecution team pressed on with their efforts to build their case against Jerry, who was charged with the murders back in 2005 and remained behind bars. He hadn't yet been convicted, but it seemed obtaining a conviction would merely be a technicality. After all, it was all widely regarded as case closed. Fast forward to 2009, location Arlington, Virginia. 20-year-old Navy Petty Officer Amanda Snell didn't make it to her shift at the Pentagon on July 13th. Naturally, her supervisor was extremely concerned. Amanda took her position very seriously, and she never failed to arrive at work as scheduled. When a welfare check was performed at the base where she lived, the knocks on her door went unanswered. Military personnel found that the door was unlocked and entered the residence. To their horror, they found exactly what they had feared. Forced into a small closet was Amanda's battered, lifeless body. It was later determined that she'd been deceased for approximately 2 days. The crime scene was processed and potential evidence was collected, though the assailant was unknown and remained at large. Several months passed. Then on February 27th of 2010, nearly 5 years after the Zion murders, another attack occurred. It happened just 3 miles from Amanda's base in Arlington. In the very early hours of the morning, 2 female graduate students returned to one of their homes after a night out. Before they could enter, however, a man suddenly appeared and threatened them with a gun. He forced them inside, where he proceeded to bind their hands using electrical appliance cords. Shortly thereafter, he took one of the women and ordered her to get into his vehicle. He drove her to a secluded area where he assaulted her, then asphyxiated her until she lost consciousness. He left her for dead, face down in a snowy, wooded area. It seems his plan had a flaw, however. She unexpectedly regained consciousness and crawled to a nearby roadway, where a Good Samaritan stopped and called for emergency assistance. Miraculously, she survived to tell her harrowing story. Little did she know, she would serve as the catalyst that set everything in motion. The young woman was able to provide a wealth of information to law enforcement. including detailed descriptions of the suspect's appearance and his vehicle. In addition to the descriptions, she provided an extremely valuable source of evidence: the DNA of the man who had attempted to take her life. Later that same February day in which the attack had occurred, a man who fit the description was located and arrested at his residence. Per Virginia law, his DNA was retrieved at the time of his arrest. When his vehicle was searched, the findings were damning. The assault survivor's university ID and earring were recovered in the back seat of his SUV. The suspect remained in prison awaiting trial during the months that followed. Then, along with June's arrival, came a development. The suspect's DNA had been run through a national offender database. Almost predictably, based on the type of crimes he was believed to have committed, another match was revealed. This time, however, the results were absolutely shocking. The crime was quite different than those in which he'd preyed upon young women. It dated back to 2005, Zion, Illinois, and the murders of two little girls, Laura and Crystal. It didn't take long to establish the connection. He was a young Zion resident at the time of the attacks. A junior in high school, he was just 16 years old, and an ominous finding came to light. He'd been a friend of Crystal's older brother. Jorge Torres was his name. Jerry was innocent. He was serving time for horrific crimes in which he had no involvement. All the while, the real monster Jorge remained free. He graduated the following year in 2006. Just a few months later, he enlisted in the Marines. It was a move a judge would later describe as an escape route, in contrast to what would normally be regarded as an honorable service. The judge was correct. It had most definitely served as a means to escape and carry out one brutal attack after another. It was then that, after more than 5 long years of misery, Jerry's life began to drastically change direction. 2 weeks after the match to Jorge was revealed, charges against Jerry were finally dropped, and he was released from prison in early August of 2010. Around the time of Jerry's release, Jorge was scheming inside the prison walls. Police believed he was orchestrating murders of potential witnesses that could be called to testify at the upcoming trial for the brutal assaults on the graduate student. As a result, they recruited a confidential informant. In exchange for a reduced sentence, the former restaurant owner, whose history included defrauding banks, agreed to participate. Over the course of a week in August, the informant was wired and successfully recorded several conversations. One in particular immediately captured the attention of law enforcement. However, it wasn't at all what they'd been anticipating.
All right, so tell me the story. So you walked into her house and then what?
There's her apartment on the basement.
Okay.
She woke up. She saw me. She couldn't believe her own eyes. So she rose her eyes. She looked at me. Yeah, she's like staring at me. So I jumped down and I covered her mouth before she could start screaming. So like I told you, I tied her up with half the cord.
You tied up her hands?
Yeah, with half her laptop cord. I was like, can't let her go. She recognizes me.
Yeah.
So I took the other half cord, put it around her neck, and I choked her off necklace.
She trying to fight you?
Yo, she's tied up. She finally passes out. Just because they pass out don't mean they're dead.
Yeah.
So I choked her out for about another 2 minutes that way.
With the cord?
To make sure she was dead. Now I got a body to deal with. Take her and I put her on the floor. I take her off the bed. So I opened up her closet. What's going on? She had room in the bottom of the closet.
Jorge described what he did to Amanda in a very casual and callous manner. The inflection in his voice is upbeat and almost like he's bragging. He was likely hoping to impress the informant. A red flag for psychopaths is that they hold themselves in very high esteem, and they want to be admired by other people as well. Although psychopath is not a clinical diagnosis, it is linked to the mental health disorder of antisocial personality disorder. To our knowledge, Jorge was never diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Jorge's extremely detailed account of his attack and murder of Amanda Snell resulted in an order for expedited testing of her bedsheet that had been collected from her apartment and stored as evidence. Jorge and Amanda were stationed at the same base, and they lived in close proximity to one another. In fact, his apartment was merely a few doors down the hall from hers. After the connection was established, it didn't come as a shock that the DNA found on the sheet belonged to Jorge. He stood trial in December of 2010 for the crimes he committed against the graduate student. He was convicted on multiple accounts, and he received 5 life sentences, in addition to 168 years of consecutive sentences. Of course, that trial was just the first. there would be more to follow. Nearly 4 years after his conviction in the case of the graduate student, Jorge's trial for the murder of Amanda finally commenced in 2014. The incriminating recordings obtained with the help of the informant were played during the proceedings. A federal jury unanimously found Jorge guilty, which came as no surprise. In late May, a federal judge sentenced him to death. After the federal proceedings concluded in mid-November of 2014, Jorge was extradited to Lake County, Illinois to await trial for the Zion murders of Laura and Crystal. Despite the fact that Jorge had already been sentenced to death, Mike Nerheim, the current state's attorney for Lake County, cited the significance of trying Jorge for Laura and Crystal's murders. This is important to the families, to the entire community. There are few things that can be worse than 2 little girls murdered on Mother's Day, and I do think this will be part of the healing process and bring closure. Perhaps he felt it would be a chance at a shred of redemption for Lake County after the shameful failures of the previous state's attorney's office were unearthed. And they had failed miserably in the case of Jerry Hobbs, as you'll soon learn. Jorge awaited trial for nearly 4 years. Finally, a plea deal was reached in mid-September of 2018. He waived his right to a trial and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison, 50 years for each little girl he admitted to killing. It's difficult for many, perhaps impossible for others, to understand what would have driven Jerry to confess to crimes he truly didn't commit. Initially, it came down to a simple fact, which Jerry summed up in a few words to his mother back in 2005. "They broke me." Of course, time would show there was much more to it. There are many different reasons why someone would confess to something they didn't do. Interrogations may last many hours, so it's not surprising that someone's defenses could break down in such a tense situation. The police interview may be intense or even manipulative, so someone could confess to escape from the interrogation itself. Police may even use deception to induce a confession by giving the suspect false information that links them to the crime. They may think that by confessing, the stressful situation will end. Many people may feel that their innocence will protect them and that they can't be punished for something they didn't do, because everything will get cleared up later. After Jerry was reintroduced to the general public, he elaborated further on his mindset at the time of the murders. His head had been clouded by not having slept in days, in addition to the unfathomable discovery of his deceased child. After years of reflection, his stance had changed relating to the source that had broken him. "I found my daughter. She didn't even have eyes in her head. I was already broken. They didn't have to break me." Details of Jerry's confession were unveiled after the charges against him were dismissed. It all started with his filing of a civil lawsuit against several Lake County law enforcement officials on grounds of malicious prosecution. At a press conference held shortly after the filing, he spoke briefly about his treatment during the interrogation.
"I'm doing this case because they was wrong. They knew they were wrong. DNA came out in 2008. They didn't give them a bond, and they just kept going forward with it."
He also described the events that led him to the point of confessing to the crimes he didn't commit.
"I just found one of my children. After that, they took me 30 minutes after, and they started terrorizing me."
Were you allowed to sleep?
No, sir, I wasn't. It went on for almost 24 hours.
When someone is in such a high-stress and tense situation, it makes sense that they focus on the immediate crisis, such as, how can I escape from this interrogation, rather than thinking about the long-term consequences of a false confession. An opinion drafted by a district judge in September of 2012 described the tactics that Jerry alleged had been used to coerce him into falsely confessing. Within the opinion was a discussion of the DNA evidence, and the details were appalling. During the autopsies of Laura and Crystal, swabs were taken from the bodies by the medical examiner. Lake County State's Attorney's Office, however, specifically instructed lab technicians on which test to perform and which to avoid. The impact of the biased testing was revealed when the court later ordered swabs be sent to a different lab for testing, as a result of a motion filed by Jerry's defense team. When the results indicated that male DNA was found from a single male source that didn't match Jerry, prosecution supplied false information to the court and refused to dismiss charges against him. It wasn't until 3 years later, when the DNA was indisputably matched to Jorge, that charges against Jerry were finally dropped. Of course, at the press conference that followed, Lake County State's Attorney Michael Waller portrayed the chain of events much more favorably than how things had actually played out.
Early in that investigation, the evidence pointed to Jerry Hobbs. Jerry Hobbs made a verbal confession. He signed a typed statement.
The Lake County State's Attorney Office would not want to admit that they mistreated a suspect, refused his request for a lawyer, and even allegedly physically assaulted him. On the other hand, it's possible that Jerry was hoping to sue, so there may have been a financial incentive for him to embellish what happened. However, given the fact that Jerry falsely confessed, and that research shows that false confessions often occur as a result of interrogation tactics, it stands to reason that Jerry is telling the truth about how he was treated. If it's true, the police officers involved likely justified their behavior because they truly believed that Jerry was guilty of brutally killing 2 children and were willing to do almost anything to get him to admit it. The opinion also summarized traumatizing experiences that Jerry stated he was forced to endure before finally succumbing to the overwhelming pressure to confess to the murders. He'd been stripped of his clothes under the pretense that they were to be analyzed for evidence. His clothing was replaced by a flimsy paper suit. It also stated that officers forced him to view graphic crime scene photos of Laura and Crystal. All the while, he was repeatedly physically intimidated, and threats were made against him and his family. Also, according to the opinion, per the instruction of prosecutors, officers were required to get a videotaped confession from Jerry. The final product had to show that Jerry's confession was voluntary. Jerry refused to read the confession multiple times. When officers threatened to arrest and charge Sheila as well, Jerry finally submitted. But it took more than one recording to capture what they needed. The second taping was used. The first just wouldn't do, as prosecutors were aware that Jerry had been assaulted and threatened in order to capture it. Of course, Jerry's counsel was never informed that there were 2 versions of the confession. It wasn't until after the recording had been created to the required standards of prosecutors that Jerry said he was finally read his Miranda rights. As a result of the collective effort, Lake County law enforcement had successfully pinned the unspeakable crimes on Jerry, the easy target who had become their scapegoat. Jerry's civil lawsuit was settled in February of 2014, and he was awarded nearly $8 million. It didn't bring the girls back, nor did it erase all the years Jerry lost while serving time for crimes he didn't commit. But Jerry helped to ignite efforts for reform within Lake County law enforcement. Once he was released, the true story of Mother's Day of 2005 was finally revealed. Laura and Crystal joined up to play that afternoon. When early evening rolled around, Jerry searched but was unable to locate the girls. Around 9 p.m., families of both Laura and Crystal were overcome with worry and alerted police that their little girls were missing. Arthur Hollabaugh, Laura's grandfather, joined Jerry, and the two searched through the night, but to no avail. Just before sunrise the following morning, while Jerry and Arthur were searching Beulah Park, they saw it. The bike the girls had been riding had been thrown into the brush toward the ravine. Within minutes, Jerry was screaming. He could see the girls from a distance, approximately 20 feet away, lying lifeless among the grass. He knew right away that he couldn't bear a closer look. As an investigation kicked off immediately, he was taken to the Zion police station for routine questioning. But soon, the questioning transformed into the lengthy, non-stop interrogations. Nearly 24 grueling hours in, there he was, reading the confession drafted by the police department, then signing off on it. He immediately began his 5 years of incarceration, awaiting the trial where prosecution was hell-bent on seeking the death penalty. Fortunately, it never came to that. Jerry would have already been exhausted after a night of no sleep, since he was out looking for his daughter. Then he was taken in for questioning right away, with no opportunity to sleep for the next 24 hours during an intense police interrogation. Extreme sleep deprivation likely played a role in Jerry doing the unthinkable, admitting to murder when he was innocent. Unfortunately, there may not have been much Jerry could have done differently, given his description of how he was treated. Police narrowed in on him immediately as the main suspect, even ignoring contradictory evidence. A major takeaway from this case is that once a false confession is given, it can be nearly impossible to take those words back. Luckily, in Jerry's case, DNA evidence later exonerated him, but if it hadn't been for the real killer's DNA, Jerry might have never been proven innocent. Knowing he was innocent kept him going during those years while he was incarcerated. He read the Bible time and time again. "I don't ride on luck, I ride on faith," Jerry later explained. His focus remained on his little girl, Laura, and her best friend, Crystal. Angels, he called them. It took 5 years, but as the old saying goes, the truth finally set him free.